Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday seminar. My name is Kathy Venema, and I'm the current president of the Lakeside Heritage Society Board. It's a great group of people, and we're glad that you all are here. And I'll do a membership plug. If you're not a member of Heritage Society or need to renew your membership, please do it before July 15th, because on the 21st of July at our Heritage Day event, we're going to pull a membership for 2025, and we have a book as a prize and a Lakeside Opoly. So if you haven't renewed your membership, you want to be part of that, and it'll be open to all members for that drawing. Okay, just a couple announcements before we introduce our speaker. Tomorrow, and we had a little glitch on Facebook, those of you who do Facebook, tomorrow's the photo workshop, how to create a photo book, family photo book with Wendy and Suzanne, is tomorrow, Monday, July 1st, not Wednesday, July 1st. We had a little social media glitz, but it is correct in the Lakesider. So Monday, 3 o'clock in the archives, Suzanne and Wendy Stuhldreher will be talking about how to create a Lakeside family photo book. On Wednesday, we have our Chautauqua lecture about the history of Chautauqua at 3:30 in the Egler Room of Fountain Inn. And then our Focused Friday tour at 10:30, and you need to sign up for that at Heritage Hall, is on fires of Lakeside. And so Phil Dale will be leading that tour. We also, yeah, he's our fire expert. Yeah, he's in the back of the room right now doing media. Also, if you haven't purchased any candy yet in our pop-up candy counter, be sure to do that. It's really good, and it's only there, and we aren't restocking, so take advantage of that. And then July 21st, we are having a fundraiser, Heritage Day, a special ice cream, cake and social out on Heritage, on Walnut Plaza. And we have a bunt queen who will be with us that day for bingo. So you don't want to miss that. And if you haven't already picked up a brochure with all of our programs, please get one of those. And then recycle sale will come up again for Labor Day. And so if you have drop-offs, we're doing that drop-offs now on Wednesdays from 10 to 12 at South Auditorium, right across from the West Wing. Stephanie Leffler will be there. And if you have things that you need picked up that are larger, like pieces of furniture, call Nancy Jacobs and she will arrange a pickup time. So today we have some gentlemen here who are going to present with, and those of you that have attend Chautauqua lectures or these lectures know that there's a man that sits against the wall at every presentation, and his name is Dave Blank. And so now you have to listen to this speech about him. So Dave Blank is a longtime Lakesider who enjoys participating in the education program of Lakeside. Among other things, Dave and Ed Brewster, who will be here today, is that ancestors of Dave and his sister, Barb Brewster, who's up here, married to Ed, owned property that became in eastern Danbury Township at the time of the War of 1812. But they sold their Danbury interest long before Lakeside was in anyone's thoughts. So in case you don't remember, Lakeside was founded in 1873. So it's after 1812. Dave graduated from the University of Mount Union, another one of those great Ohio Division III schools. He says deep in the last century. But anyway, he has a graduate degree in economics and a JD from Cleveland State. He served as an adjunct professor at Tiffin University, the University of Akron, and Mount Union, focusing on economics and finance topics. Dave and Bonnie have been able to spend their summers at Lakeside since Dave retired from his 40-year career that was in regulatory and financial positions at First Energy Corporation and its predecessor companies. They are parents of 2 adult children and grandparents of 2 boys and a girl, and they're coming to Lakeside soon. Among other Lakeside activities, he's currently a member of the Lakeside Foundation Board. He served on the Lakeside Association Board, where he chaired the Finance Committee. And do you want me to say you're also no? Okay. Dave has a lifelong interest in history, focusing on many areas, including, among others, Ohio, 19th century America, and the American Civil War. And our other presenter is Ed Brewster, and he's been coming to Lakeside since the summer of 1986. He was introduced to Lakeside by his soon-to-be then wife, Barb, and discovered this very, very special place. His current job is a cyber security analyst for the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio. And as a government contractor for the past 26 years, Ed supported the email system, served as infrastructure services manager, and IT security officer. Lately, he has had responsibilities for the firewalls, VPN services, and remote access to the GRC campus. Ed was part of the team that live streamed all of the solar eclipse events from the Great Lakes Science Center in April. His current role has him supporting the emergency 9/11 systems at Kennedy Space Center and providing IT support for the Hypersonics Technology Program at Langley Research Center in Virginia. Bet you didn't know all that. Prior to NASA, Ed worked for 20 years at Gould Ocean Systems Division in Euclid, Ohio, and Gould built torpedoes for the Navy, and Ed was a systems engineer that analyzed in-water torpedo data. He received his BS degree in math from the University of Albuquerque and his master's degree in mathematics from Cleveland State University. Ed and Barb purchased their cottage on Central Avenue in 1991, and they live here during the summer. Ed and Barb have 1 son who lives in Columbus, and he owns a bookstore in the Short North Arts District. So we welcome Ed and Dave and Barb as they present our Sunday seminar. So thank you all for coming, and turn it on to you.
Well, thank you for having us share our story today. And this will either be very short, as Kathy said, the War of 1812 happened some 60 years before Lakeside was founded, so if you'd rather enjoy the sunshine, this could be very short. On the other hand, if you want to hear the story of how one of our ancestors lost Lakeside as part of the War of 1812, we can go on. And I'd particularly like to thank a couple people for being here. Diane and Jody from the Firelands Historical Society in Norwalk, who were very helpful to us, as well as Huron County Recorder Jan Katch, who's here today with her husband. And thank you so much for your assistance in helping us get this together. And wonderful, wonderful institutions in any event. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Ed about how we even got into this.
Thanks, Dave. Okay. So you have a couple of numbers guys up here. You know, we're not historians, and you know, how does that figure with the War of 1812? And you know, I certainly wasn't born back then.
I was, though.
Okay. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll kind of understand our connection to the war and to this area, and maybe you'll find out that there's a lot of bull in Dave's family. So what brought us here today? So our family was doing our summer reunion here, Dave and us and the rest of us. And in 1991, Marblehead celebrated their 100th birthday of them being here, and they published this article, this pamphlet. And in the pamphlet, it talks about the beginning, and it talks about an Ephesus bull that owned significant land on the peninsula. And I knew that in Dave's family tree that there was a bull line. So we talked to Dave's brother Chuck, who's very much into ancestry and genealogy, and we found out that the Ephesus bull that's a direct line in Dave and Barb's ancestors was in New York. They weren't in Ohio. So what was the connection? You know, that name, Ephesus bull, it's like, you know, how many of them can really be out there?
And we know of at least 4, by the way.
Yeah. So, you know, it's the same name and the same spelling as their third great grandfather. You know, could this be the Ephesus that's in our family tree? So let's find out. So we're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit before the War of 1812, and we're going to set the stage, and I'll turn it back over to Dave.
I'm not going to embarrass anybody by reading things. I hope everyone can see this. And by the way, I know there are a number of people in this room who know an awful lot more about Lakeside and the history of Lakeside and the history of the War of 1812 than either one of us ever will. So if we need corrected, please correct us. The United States Congress declared war on Great Britain in the summer of 1812. The war lasted 2.5 years and basically ended as a status quo ante between the two countries. But lots of people were hurt as part of this process, particularly the Native Americans, and of course all the individuals who were hurt individually by that as well. Northwest Ohio, including this area, was an early theater in the war, and the area now encompassing Lakeside, which of course was founded decades later, was significantly affected as well. One member of our family, whose name was Epiphras Wadsworth Bull, and we'll put it up here so you can all read it, owned substantial portions of Danbury Township at that point in time. We'll talk about how that came about. But so this is the intertwined story of the War of 1812 and our family ownership of some of this property. And Ed and I will try to take turns doing this. Why the War of 1812? Why did it happen? We'll talk about the background to some extent, what the strategy of the British and the United States were in that, a little bit about commanders, and what I call the war in the West, the war in this area. Ed's going to speak more toward the Connecticut connections, the creation and distribution of the firelands, Epiphras Wadsworth Bull, and we may refer to him as EWB. Sometimes you're going to see his name as Epaphroditus. There are about 30 other ways you can spell it, but the family Bible says Epiphras. They fled from this area in 1812. We'll talk about that. We're going to mention the Battle of the Peninsula. There was a little skirmish here. No skirmish is little for the people who are impacted by it. And then we'll talk about some post-war ideas as well. How did this happen? How did this war come about? And there's a lot of background here, both for the war and for Connecticut. But I think much of the local story starts with the relationship between the British and then the Americans and the indigenous peoples, the Indians. These relationships were on again, off again throughout the history of the United States and British colonies, ever since early Virginia and in New England, the British settlements in New England, where there were Native American conflicts with the settlers. And somehow this always seems to be the Anglo-Americans want more land, attempt to negotiate. Sometimes whoever's walking down through the woods, they pay him $5 and buy the land. Of course, that person never had anything to do with any of the land. So now the Americans or the British think they have a contract. This list shows some of the conflicts. You've all read about much of this in your Ohio history courses, and of course some of you grew up in Texas and didn't take Ohio history, and I'm sorry, Mac, but we can give you private courses if you want it, and there are others who can here as well. But a long, long history of what went on, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on other than that. But I think this map is kind of indicative of what's going on, at least in the Northwest Territories. At the close of the American Revolution, settlers begin pouring into the West over the Appalachians. The impact of the Royal Proclamation Line, which the British put into place after the French and Indian War, that said the Anglos stay on the east, it's native property on the west, more or less. Who on the east paid attention to that? Only a few people. Most of the people came flooding over through the Cumberland Gap and then up into Ohio and into Kentucky. Well, federal policy at the time, which I learned this, particularly under Madison and Jefferson, was to extinguish Native American rights to these western lands. And so the governors of the various territories had instructions to go find the right people to negotiate, or go find some people to negotiate with, and get them to agree to move. And you can see in all these blocks that with all the dates pointed out, where in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, the land which was available to the Native Americans kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And of course, some of the Native American leaders were saying, when is this ever going to stop? And that leads to more concerns. Pontiac's Rebellion, which again, you people schooled in Northwest Ohio or Northwestern Territory history know, at the end of the French and Indian War, a Native American leader called Pontiac attempted to put together a confederation, which was very successful for a short period of time in booting the American English settlers out of the Northwest Territory. But that was defeated ultimately. 40 years later, two Shawnee brothers, the Prophet, or Tenskwata, and his older brother Tecumseh, sought to reprise that confederacy. Tecumseh traveled all around what was then the United States, seeking other tribes to be allied and be part of this confederacy. And he too was very successful in putting this together. His brother, the Prophet, was more of a behind-the-scenes politician in all of this. He was a younger brother, and they were very successful to get the Native Americans to become allied with the British, who kept promising that they would take care of them. Well, you've got to be careful who you make agreements with, I guess. So it's not a surprise that Americans seeking to settle the West were opposed both to the British and to the Native Americans. We'll focus on Connecticut for a couple minutes.
So Connecticut was chartered around 1630, and it received the proclamation from King Charles II, granting the colony access from sea to sea, and it was named the South Sea, but really the Pacific Ocean. And they had it between the 41st parallel, which you see here, and the 42nd parallel. And that was all what was given to them by the King's proclamation. And after the Revolutionary War, they had significant debt that they had to take care of. So to relieve that debt, they succeeded the area for Pennsylvania and southern New York, and also the lands to the west, except the Connecticut Western Reserve, which is a little over 3 million acres there. And it was the dividing line between Pennsylvania and Ohio, and there were several times that they did that survey, and unfortunately, the line kind of moved here and there. so there was a lot of disagreements even between the colonies that you see, New York and Connecticut, New Hampshire and New York, even the Ohio state line, and Michigan. And we know that the Toledo War came much later in the latter part of the century. And we still kind of have that disagreement to this day with that state up north, but most of that disagreement is played out on a football field. And we'll be mentioning Ohio State on occasion, so just that's for you alumni that happen to be here with us today. So why do we focus on Connecticut? Well, that is the origin of why the Connecticut Reserve was there, and it's also the origin of where the Bull family resided at the time. So let's talk a little bit about Connecticut. So the British had basically taken over New York City and moved all of the Patriots out. And this location is where a lot of the Patriots had their supply depots, their machines, the manufacturing, and also their seaports. And between the years of 1777 and 1781, the British came through here because it was too close to New York, and they basically wiped out all of these cities, all these towns. They burned everything. They destroyed all the manufacturing. Any vessels they had were scuttled, and basically the people that were in these towns had nothing left. So what does Connecticut do? Well, we know that the government moves kind of slowly, and this is very much one of those cases. So it was kind of a slow motion time. The sufferers, they start the petition in 1787. Connecticut in 1792 finally sets aside the land for them, the 500,000 acres. But it would be actually 16 more years before relief, because that's when they finally determined that the number of sufferers and their claims and what their claims were. And so the 500,000 acres were divided up based on the claim of the sufferer. So some people got more, some people got less. And in 1796, the rest of the Western Reserve was sold to the Connecticut Land Company for $1.2 million. So then the sufferers established a company, and this land, which was in the Northwest Territory, was still Indian land. So they went out and started purchasing, like Dave said. They started, finding the tribes and people that were there, and they just started buying the land up. And then they, of course, divided the land up among the sufferers. But not very many people in Connecticut wanted really to move to Ohio. It would be kind of like, we sold you some land in Australia, and we'd like you to move there. And so many of the sufferers or their heirs, because it took so long before they were given rights as to part of this 500,000 acres, that there were speculators that would buy up this land, and very few people moved that had rights to the property in the firelands. So there was multiple surveys done from 1806, 1808, and so these surveys were done so that they could allocate properly the parcels to the different people that did have a suffering claim, and then that claim that they had could be sold to one of the speculators. And so the speculators acquire significant portions of the land. And so this is how they did the surveys. So this is a Gunter chain, and a measurement is a Gunter measurement.
And this is from your museum, Diane. Yes, we acknowledge that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And so that's about I would say maybe 100 links or so. And a rod that they use is 16 and a half feet. It's a quarter of the survey chain. You can kind of see on the left side here a little bit that there's a tag. And they had put a tag or a brass ring about every 10 links, so that if you stretched out 100 links, you didn't have to count each one each time that you were making a survey. And 10 of these chains would make up a furlong. And you know that today in horse racing, they still use that term. And the other thing that they use is that 80 chains, when it's measured out, make up a mile in U.S. measurements. So if you take 80 chains times the 66 feet, you come up with 5,280 feet. So now you know how we got to that to be a measured mile. And of course, the lakeside properties, there's a lot of properties that have 33 feet width, and that was easily done by just measuring out 2 rods and then so many rods in the depth of the property. Now, the company, the Suffers Company, they paid Alman Ruggles $2 per mile that he surveyed. And eventually they did some surveys, and there was other folks that did surveys, but they were only paid if the survey was correct. So I don't know how many times that they had to do that. We know that there were several times that they had to redo surveys, and eventually we have documentation in 1808 that Alman Ruggles was paid $3 per mile for his surveys and $50 for expenses. So what is the fire lens? So this is a map based on Alman Ruggles' survey, and it's 5 miles is each of the townships. And you'll notice that there's several names on here, the Norwalk, Greenfield, Norwalk, Groton, Danbury, Ruggles, and they're liking to the towns that were burned and the people lost their land in Connecticut. And so these are the towns that are in the fire lens that sort of correspond to the towns that were burned earlier by the British. So also at the Society is a book. And this book is a book that Alman Ruggles did when he does surveys. And so the book contains sketches and notes and descriptions made by Alman when he was out surveying the properties. This particular page talks about his surveying in Norwalk, Ohio. And this is also on display at the Fire Lens Historical Museum. So, Ephesus Wadsworth Bull. So we know that the name Ephesus, and we've known that there's been various spellings, and some of the markers say Aphrodite and things like that. But Day's family actually has the Bull's Bible, and it spells correctly the name Ephesus, and that's how it's spelled. So we know that it's the correct spelling. So the Ephesus is a biblical name. He was from the city of Colossus in what is now Turkey, and he was named both in Colossians and the Philemon. Ephesus was born about 1780. His dad's name was also Ephesus, and his dad was a major in the Revolutionary Army. Unfortunately, he died around 1781 near Yorktown. Ephesus became a lawyer in Danbury, Connecticut, and he became interested in the Western lands. So Ephesus, he purchased property from some of the original sufferers in Danbury Township and also Norwalk, Ohio. So why do do we care about Ephesus? Well, we know that Dave and his sister Barb, they're related to this Ephesus. He is the nephew of their fourth great-grandfather. Do we have an image of Ephesus? No. But in the lower right corner is a picture of his son, Edward Coleman Bull. He has a bookish, scholarly demeanor, sort of leading to his clerical profession. Did he resemble his dad? Well, Ephesus was also kind of a bookish, scholarly man, a lawyer by training, and he grew up in the home of a very prosperous merchant ship owner grandfather. When Dave found this picture, he was hoping that it looked someone like John Wayne or Bruce Willis, but unfortunately...
No such luck.
Yeah, right. So Edward, pictured here, is the second cousin to Dave and Barb, 4 times removed. So let's talk about the properties a little bit. So we know that Ephesus and his wife owned property in Norwalk, sorry. And very briefly, as part of a consortium, he owned most of Danbury in Section 4. So Section 1 is to the right of the line. Section 2 is to the left of the line. Section 3 is what we think of today as Catawba Island, and then Section 4 is the western part of the township. But his primary and much longer-term holding was all of Section 1. And also that included what is now Johnson's Island, but at the time was called Bull's Island. There is a deed of property that's at the Huron County Recorder's Office that shows title to those lands. Also, a finding that we had in the Recorder's Office is that Ephesus sold property to Benijah Wolcott. Benijah was one of the group that came from Danbury to survey the land, and he wanted to live there. So Ephesus sold him some property on the south part of the peninsula, and also where you have the lighthouse, the estate of Ephesus Bull sold the land that's on the point to the U.S. government so that they could build the lighthouse there in 1821. So as a speculator, Ephesus was buying property for 40 cents an acre, and he was going to sell it at a profit for $1 an acre. That would kind of mean that he purchased Lakeside property for about $70, all of Lakeside. If you want to include Island View, just add on another $11.60. There you go. So let's talk a little bit about where people lived. So here is a map of the Firelands at the time, and Almond Ruggles was part of the group that did this survey. And our next slide will kind of focus on Danbury there, but just some important things to turn out is that this is where an orchard is built, and we also had orchards here from the French. Previous to the war, French Canadians would come across and they built orchards, and that would allow them to come back from time to time and also harvest the fruit at the end of the summer. These are the different towns in that. Of note, Wolcott's cabin is sitting right here on the south part of the peninsula. We know that the stone house is over here a little bit on the main part of the peninsula. And so there's some discrepancies as far as whether the Wolcott cabin was indeed at the same location that the stone house sits today. And also to note that over here on the bottom part, right here, is where it says that Almond Ruggles had his property. And if you go by there on Route 6 today, you'll know that you're looking at Ruggles Beach. So, we'll go on the enlargement. So when we enlarge this, we see that on Bull's Island, you have Bull's name, Sanders, and also Stevens. The three of them really wanted to build a town on the island. The Custom House was also there, and the Bull's Island and also the cabin are instrumental in the saving of many of the lives of the militia and also the people that were volunteers to help fend off the Indians. We notice that there's no settlement or anything happening in this area here. What we know by the drawings and the pictures of just before Lakeside was purchased, all of Lakeside, is that you notice on the pictures, especially like in the hotel, that there are orchards on the east side of Lakeside when it was bought. And now I think we're going to talk about the war.
Well, let's go back to the War of 1812. Why did this ever happen? And there are volumes written about this, and I'm not going to repeat all of those volumes, fortunately. But there were three primary causes that scholars talk about. And this is one of the wars that should not have taken place. A negotiated settlement of this was clearly possible, perhaps except for the time and distance between the principals. You had to go across an ocean. Conflict over commercial rights of traders was a primary part of this. Restrictions were imposed by the British and the French on who could trade, and they didn't want supplies going to anybody else. Remember, the British were involved in a little war with a guy called Napoleon at this point in time, which is where the British interests were concerned about. They weren't terribly concerned about some western lands that are far, far away. You remember the term impressment of seamen. Well, this is part of the War of 1812 as well. Perhaps as many as 10,000 sailors were removed from merchant vessels and military vessels, naval vessels by the British, with the claims that those individuals were really British citizens, and they couldn't just eliminate that by moving their allegiance. In the West, though, the Western expansion of the Americans at that point in time into these properties, which ostensibly still were part of Native American areas, was a huge part of this. And of course, the Native Americans didn't just take this sitting down. They raided, they attacked, and there was lots of conflict between British and Americans over this period, or British and Americans and Native Americans at this point in time. At the time, the Congressional War Hawks were in charge of the Congress, particularly Henry Clay of Kentucky, who at that point was about age 35, and a guy named John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who was about age 30. And you can imagine these two young bucks wanting to make names for themselves and saying, we can get in a war, not to worry. The Brits are tied up across the ocean with Napoleon, and just by invading Canada, we can gain leverage and gain all what we need in terms of these trading rights, get rid of the impressment of seamen, and get the Native Americans out of Northwest Territories. Well, good luck. Inadequate leadership on both sides, communications difficulties, all ended up with the war happening. Jefferson, who was still around at the time, now former president, tells Madison, you can just march into Canada and they're going to give up immediately. Now, somehow Jefferson forgot that where did the American loyalists go at the end of the American Revolution? Well, some of them went to Ontario. They didn't all go to Halifax, but some of them did. But the Canadians were not, and the other Canadians were French. They didn't want to have anything to do with the United States. And of course, remember, Napoleon is still the primary interest. But so the U.S. strategy here is they can gain negotiating leverage by marching into Canada on three fronts. One in the west, up through Detroit to Windsor, or then Amherstburg. One up the east coast, or up the eastern areas through Lake Champlain and Vermont. And the third in the Niagara region. The Brits, on the other hand, as I said, this is just a sideshow. They said, we can engage the Native Americans to fight our battles for us, which they were successful in doing. We need to maintain control of the Great Lakes so that the Americans have difficulties getting men and supplies to where they need to fight us. And you know what? We can figure out how to make a quick advance into Detroit and get them out of there and cause the Americans to sue for peace. And maintain maritime dominance worldwide, where they were also successful. Here's the Western theater of the war. Governor Hall of Michigan had been asked by Madison to lead by President Madison to lead the American armies in the West. He initially said, no, I'm 59 years old. Although I was in the Revolutionary War, this is too much for me. Let somebody else do it who's younger. Madison goes to somebody else who's younger, who on his trip to Washington to accept this gets sick and has to withdraw. Madison goes back to Billy Hall and says, I got to ask you again, and how do you say no to a president is basically what goes on. But Hall did. He said, I will do this, but only if you support me with adequate supplies and people. And of course, the president agrees. Hall becomes the general responsible for the Western armies. They advanced forces from Ohio and Kentucky and a little bit from Indiana up to Detroit, where he had planned to assault the British forces at Amherstburg. But due to Washington incompetence, we've never heard that before, the word that the war had been declared went to the British before General Hall heard about it. And the British were able to take over Fort Mackinac up at the top of the southern peninsula of Michigan before anybody on the American side had heard that there was a war declared. So that, how fun can that be? That led the Native Americans to say, yeah, I think we can redouble our efforts by joining the winning side now on the British. Hall starts his campaign into Amherstburg. Hears about the defeat at Mackinac and withdraws his forces back to Detroit. And now you have some other interesting things happening up in that area. You have General Dearborn, who's in charge of the forces, the whole theater of war, is in charge in Niagara. He comes to an agreement with General Brock of the British Army to only have to fight on the defense. So they each agree to only fight on the defense. Well, Brock's a lot smarter than Dearborn. And Brock says, well, that means I can withdraw all my soldiers and move them to Detroit, which he did. And so now all of a sudden, Hall is facing not just the people at Amherstburg, but now the people who had been at Niagara, plus the Native Americans, and he's terrified. So who's in charge? On the American side, we put up five people. Madison was the commander-in-chief, 61 years old at the time. He'd been persuaded that invasion of Canada would be a cakewalk. So they didn't prepare. They relied on the local militia and no other real war preparations. The Secretary of War was Dr. William Eustis. He'd been a surgeon in the American Revolutionary War, no other military experience in terms of management of conflict, and he was awful. Incomplete, late, inconsistent orders. When he sends Hall the news that the war has been declared, he doesn't have a special messenger system. He uses what was then the, quote, the regular mail, which is whoever you can find who's going in that area, you have them take the message. Hence the British get the word first. I already talked about General Dearborn and how he was outwitted at Niagara. Bill Hall, from my reading, he was a stalwart, but now out of his element. He was not a general. He was an administrative guy. He was the wrong man, the wrong time, and of course he was claimed to be a coward by his opponents. But I think he had a different objective. He was trying to protect the residents of Michigan as the governor of Michigan at the time. Well, Hall surrenders Detroit, and he's court-martialed for that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we have our hero down at the lower right, General William Henry Harrison, who later, of course, became president. Was an ambitious young man. He was 39 years old. He was one of the first families of Virginia. His father signed the Declaration of Independence and was governor of Virginia. And he had been the governor of Indiana, the territory of Indiana. He had a lot of experience with Tecumseh and the Indian tribes. Tecumseh hated him, by the way. And Harrison, after the surrender of Detroit, was actually supported by the government. They gave him as many soldiers and supplies as necessary. On the British side, focused on three folks. George Prevost was the name of the theater commander. He continued to seek the opportunity to negotiate, not conflict, but negotiation, without success. He was not a fan of aggressive war. On the other hand, his subordinate, General Isaac Brock, was a very capable military commander, a young man at the time, 43, with a great future in front of him. He was aggressive, respected by his forces. He led from the front, but to his own demise at the Battle of Queenstown after the surrender of Detroit. Queenstown is in Ontario, near Niagara. Brock had successfully maneuvered General Hall to surrender Detroit. Brock is replaced by General Proctor, Henry Proctor, who was a long-term British Army officer, competent. He's respected by his men, but not a particularly inspiring leader. He followed instructions. He wasn't a great initiator. So when Prevost says, well, perhaps it's better that you not try to engage in conflict, he followed him, whereas Brock would have ignored all that. And I don't have the photo up here, but Tecumseh was perhaps the most able of any of the British people. Now we have a cameo appearance by my sister Barb Brewster, who's going to read from a memoir which Polly Bull, the wife of Epiphras Bull, wrote to the Firelands Pioneer, which was a historical journal, copies of which are at the library of the Firelands Museum, and we've read a lot of it, and it's really kind of fun. But in 1859, a letter or a reminiscence is published that Polly Bull wrote the year before, which talks about their experience in the war. So, Barb? I wanted Barb to wear a bonnet, but she refused to do it. So.
Soon after the declaration of war with Great Britain, our company erected a blockhouse for a place of refuge in case of attack. During the summer, rumors of war and dread of its actual approach rendered us somewhat disquieted. Some, taking counsel of their fears, left the peninsula. It was not, however, until sometime in August, when our whole family was suffering with chills and fever, that actual danger seemed to threaten us. One morning, men upon the lake shore informed us that the boats of the enemy were coming down the lake and seemed prepared to land. We supposed the party to consist of hostile Indians. All of the families then upon the peninsula embarked in the same boat, and so we crossed over. It soon began to rain, and we took refuge for a short time in a log house that had been deserted, hoping that the rain would abate, but finding that it did not, we started in the midst of it for Huron on foot. After proceeding some distance, we reached a creek, which a short time before, as we learned afterwards, our 2 hired men, carrying my 2 youngest children, had crossed in safety, so swollen with rain that we could not follow them. We spent the night in the woods. In the morning, we received intelligence of Hall's surrender and of the disbandment of his forces, and that those who we supposed to be the enemy were our own troops, on their way home. We knew, therefore, that we must make preparations for final flight and return to the peninsula with all haste to do so. The next day, toward sundown, our men returned with our children, to our great joy, having been absent 2 days and nights. After making very hasty preparation, bearing the most valuable of our housekeeping articles, we crossed the bay just at night. After a fatiguing and perilous ride, we reached Vermilion in safety. We put up at the house of Mr. Alman Ruggles, where we were very kindly and hospitably entertained for several weeks. A few days after our arrival, our hired men went back to reconnoiter and was shot by the Indians, and our house they burnt to the ground. Mr. Bowl, meanwhile, had taken horse for Cleveland to seek armed protection for his settlement and company. For some time, 2 or 3 weeks perhaps, though it seemed to me much longer, at Vermilion we heard nothing whatever from him, to our very great distress. Our anxiety was, finally, measurably relieved by a letter from him stating that he had been very sick, but was convalescent, and desiring me to join him at Cleveland with our family without delay. We did so, but though able to meet us at our landing, he soon relapsed fatally and expired October 6, 1812. His fatigue and corroding anxiety regarding his family and friends seemed to overpower him. Owing nevertheless to the very great kindness of General Alfred Kelly and Major Carter, we made suitable arrangements, and in January 1813 went to my father's house in New Milford, Connecticut, traveling the whole distance except some 10 miles in a sleigh.
So that letter was published in March of 1859 in the Firelands Pioneer. But Ephesus wasn't the only casualty in this flight away from the peninsula. Unfortunately, Mrs. Wolcott, Benijah's first wife, also passed away, as well as both of the men that Bull had hired, Mixon and Woolsey, also lost their battle with illness. We don't know if it was malaria or cholera or possibly typhoid. There's no records that indicate things that has been published. So, and just as another point, it was actually Benajah's second wife, Rachel, who assumes the lighthouse duties when Benajah dies, and she became the first lighthouse keeper in the U.S.
There was some excitement on the peninsula during the War of 1812, and frankly, this is about a month after the Bull family and the other families on the peninsula fled. This conflict involved a few dozen warriors on both sides, the Ohio militia and Potawatomi Indians. The militia, or the Potawatomi, had come in from the west on the green lines, more or less. Those are my lines. I didn't go out and look for tracks or anything like that. At the same time, there's a group of Ohio militia in 4 boats, 4 scows, they're called, bringing supplies up from Fort Sandusky, which is now Fremont, to go to Avery. And Avery is down the Huron River near Milan. And they were bringing food supplies across the bay. They get hung up in a storm. They take refuge on Bull's Island, and 2 local men approach them, and this is Joseph and Valentine Ramsdell. And the Ramsdells live up near the entrance to East Harbor. They'd moved there a couple years before, and they reported that there were these 40-some Indians who were destroying their properties. Well, the 18 men who can actually count say, well, 18 is less than 47. Those guys have rifles. We have rifles. Maybe that's not a good odds. Let's go get some more people. So they go back to Fort Avery and return the next day with about a total of about 70 militia people. They head up to the Ramsdell farm. They land near the Wolcott cabin. They go up to where the Indians had been spotted the day before. They are led by young Valentine Ramsdell. And the Ramsdell family is still on the peninsula and very active, as I understand. The Indians are gone, so the militia start their return to the Bay Point area where the cabin is. They go a mile or 2 down the non-road just across the fields, and there's tall grass, and the Indians ambush them. Valentine Ramsdell is killed immediately, and another man is injured. So they have a fighting exchange all the way back the 6 or 7 miles to Bay Point, where some of the militia under Captain Cotton head to the cabin and take refuge in the Wolcott cabin. The rest, maybe they don't know where the cabin is. There aren't records about that. But they head down to Bay Point, and they go down to the tip of Bay Point. There were soldiers at Cedar Point at that point, just across the bay, who hear the firing, take boats back up, and rescue the people in Bay Point, but they don't know about the people in the cabin. So those guys are stuck there, and they're there for another day or 2. Finally, the people at Cedar Point learn about the people in the cabin, and they go back to Fort Avery, get more reinforcements, and by the time they get back, the Potawatomi have left. Well, there are about between 4 and 8 militia were killed in this. The precise numbers are really not known very well. There are 8 names there was a monument, battle monument at Battlefield Park, which is on the south side of the peninsula, just near the Johnson's Island entrance. And the way we know about all this, these details, is a future congressman. His name is Joshua Giddings, who became a famous abolitionist from Kinsman, Ohio, writes about it. and he's the one who sponsors the installation of this monument in 1857. So it's called the first conflict in Ohio in the War of 1812. There were subsequent conflicts. After the surrender of Detroit, General Harrison replaces Hull as the Western Army chief. The British continued to control Lake Erie, so that stymies movement of American troops and supplies. And now we begin to know some of the story from here. Harrison's men under General Wilkinson attack up into Detroit without authorization, according to Harrison, although there are some other materials that say maybe it was under his orders. Harrison didn't want to have anything to do with it because this became the River Raisin Massacre, where Wilkinson's men it didn't turn out well for them. The British at this point were emboldened by this. They came down to Fort Meigs, which had been established on the Maumee River in Perrysburg. They sieged it, withdrew. A month later, sieged it again, withdrew. The fortress had been designed to withstand a siege, and it did. It succeeded. Then the British then say, well, there's this other little fort called Fort Stevenson, which is near Tiffin, actually, I believe. And a young man named George Croghan, who's a regular Army officer, who happens to be the nephew of George Rogers Clark and William Clark, whose names you have heard, associated with the American Revolutionary War and the Lewis and Clark expedition. Despite having orders from Harrison to withdraw, he defends the fort and succeeds against vastly outnumbered. Of course, at the same time, Harrison had begun to get the United States government behind the construction of a fleet up in Erie, Pennsylvania, at Presque Isle. We all know about that. And I don't have to go through the story of the Battle of Lake Erie, which you all can probably recite. But the Battle of Lake Erie, the result of that is the British no longer have control of the lakes any longer. Now they're the ones who can't get their men and get their supplies where they need them to be. And that leads for the opportunity for Harrison then to load up his soldiers out of Port Clinton, out of Toledo. They head up to Detroit. They cross the river to chase the British out of that area. The Native Americans follow them. The Native Americans persuade General Proctor to stop and fight. They fight at the Battle of Moraviantown, which is about 60 miles up the peninsula in Ontario, to the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh is killed. And that's basically the end of the Native American Confederacy. So what's the rest of the story, and then we'll be done. Polly Bull returns to Connecticut, like Barb said. Her 3 kids grow up in Connecticut. Son Epiphras ultimately goes to Texas, where he's never heard from again. Is that what happens to people in Texas? I'm not sure. Yeah. Daughter Emily Bull married a lawyer. She went to Litchfield Female Seminary, which was adjacent to the Litchfield Law School where their dad had attended. She married this New Milford, Connecticut lawyer. They had 2 children. They had no grandchildren. The son, Edward Cole, whose picture we had up there, graduated from Yale in 1826. He graduated from law school in Poughkeepsie, New York. He was admitted to the bar. Then he decides, I don't want to do that, so he goes to theology school in Virginia. He's ordained in the Episcopal Church, had several pastorates, and he retired early due to health. He was married twice. His first wife passed away, and he had no children. So at this point, here's my family loses all of this. All of that property could have gone to the other relative in New York State, but it didn't, because they were able to sell that property. Polly Bull and and the two remaining children were able to sell that property, including Lakeside, until the 1870s. And it's all gone by about 1873, which is about when Lakeside is started. So that's the story. How did we lose Lakeside? How did this area engage in the War of 1812? Again, some acknowledgments. Thank you again, ladies, for all your help in doing this. Some references, if you're interested. And we're now over time, but if you want to, we're here for questions if you want to, either afterwards or if you want to spend a couple minutes. Cindy and Kathy, we're going to make run around with the
Right.
microphones. So if anybody has any questions, we're happy to see what we can do or refer to other people who actually know something. Gretchen.
Were you able, through the Ottawa County Recorder's Office, to determine the last Bull family member, which may have been one of Polly's two children, who ended up selling the property to the immediate predecessors from whom the Lakeside Company purchased the land?
I have not found that one yet.
Okay.
We found the Johnson's Island, where they sold it to him, and a number of other of the properties, but I haven't found the Lakeside one. I'm sure it's there somewhere. We just didn't find it yet.
So Johnson's Island was actually, you saw on the map that there were Sanders and Stevens and Bull. They had divided up the island into 4 quadrants: the northwest, northeast, southeast, and they each owned a different part of the island. And it was their intent to build a town there, and that's where the custom house was, and that's in that time period, that is where you paid your customs fees when you were bringing goods into Sandusky. And so that's why they wanted to have that island to be that kind of thing. But eventually, the other properties were sold, and eventually the Bulls holdings on that island were also sold.
Why did they think they could ever build a city on Bull's Island? Sandusky didn't exist yet. Sandusky the settlement there was called Ogonst. And then it was later called Portland, I believe, and it wasn't until the 1820s it became Sandusky and the county seat. And it wasn't the county seat until Erie County's formed out of Huron County, 10 or 15 years later. So Sandusky didn't exist. And how did you get places around here? By water. So Bulls Island was a great place, particularly in the west side, where you'd be protected from the storms and such.
Other questions?
Bob.
So, Ed, I think you alluded to Benasia Wolcott having a home prior to what we understand, what we know is the Wolcott home on the south side of the peninsula. Say a little bit more about that.
So the cabin there is located really close to the point, and so we believe that because the quarrying hadn't really started yet in 1810, 1811, that was a log cabin that was built and then eventually burned. And then it was the property that he got that was closer to the entrance that we have now to Johnson's Island.
And we have that deed too. That's about an 1822 deed for the Stonehouse area.
Right, and that was approximately 160 acres, I was told. And from the period of 1812 on, it was from the estate of Bull. And it was Stevens that was the executor of the estate, and he also was a member of Congress. So when Congress was looking to put a lighthouse somewhere in the Great Lakes, and he's the executor of the estate, he raises and said, hey, I got this nice piece of land sitting right over here on the end of the peninsula. I could sell it to you for a real good price. And we do know that from some records that Polly Bull actually sold some of the property in Norwalk for $4 an acre.
So they made some money. The Bull family really never had to work again because they were able to sell off this property for their living for the next, 50 years.
And we also know that the families really didn't come back to the peninsula for a couple of years. Horace Ramsdell came back and buried the men that were killed during the fighting, but that was over a year later. And it wasn't until after the Battle of 1813 on the lake and the people being able to be safely protected that the families finally started moving back to the peninsula. And we do know that the Ramsdell family, they married a Kelly. One of the daughters married a Pettibone. And we do know that there's still family members, descendants from the pioneer families, like Paul Clemens, Judge Moon, Mrs. Parks. They're all part of the descendants from the first families of the peninsula.
Did you ever locate an obituary or death notice for Polly Bull once she returned to Connecticut? Is that on your list to find?
Someday we need to find that. The last things we have from Polly are this 1859 reminiscence, which she sends to the Firelands Pioneer, but then there's some deeds as well beyond that where her name is on them.
I believe it's the right Ramsdell. If you go to the Lakeside Heritage Society website, we have some records, and Ramsdell is one of the records that's there. And there's a early picture of a cottage, and that's one of the people records that we've created, Lori Schweitzer's created. And so we're trying to do that with lots of families, but there is Ramsdell information on our site if you go to the online collection. Other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned Judge Moon. You're referring to Judge Paul Moon,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Have either of you had an opportunity to sit down with him and review your research?
No.
No, we
Okay,
have not at
I
this
would
time.
strongly encourage you
Great.
to do that. Judge Moon is a descendant of the Kellys and the Wolcotts,
Okay.
right? And a conclusion that I'm drawing from your presentation is your family members and Judge Moon's family members would have had a close association. Am I
Right. I believe that because there were a very small number of families up here when Epiphras was up here, maybe 7 to 10, something like that. They would have known each other.
Yeah. I really do encourage you to seek out Paul and compare notes. Paul has a brother, Bill, who lives in Port Clinton as well.
Okay.
But
Well, maybe you can help us with an introduction.
yeah, be glad to.
Yeah, I know that sometimes Paul has shown up at some of the festivals, lighthouse festivals and things, and when the Stone House had activities or events there as well.
Will your presentation be available on the society website?
It will. It may take a while, but it'll be there.
I can send it to you if you want me to, Richard, as well, if you'd like me to do that.
But we do tape all of our Sunday seminars, and then they are available, usually not within the season, but soon afterwards.
And there's another question back here.
Was the Walcott cabin really burned? We're very remote descendants as well, and I was told that because of his wonderful friendships with the Native Americans, it was not burned.
I don't think there were records of it being burned. I mean, it was not attacked by the Native Americans in the 1812 skirmish because the land around it was cleared enough that, the Indians were smart enough not to do that. And there's no record that I know of it being destroyed at all.
I was just curious.
Well, great.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Oh, another one. Diane. Another lady who knows an awful lot about this stuff and a descendant of Almond Ruggles.
Yes, I am also a descendant of Daniel Mingus,
And Daniel Mingus was one of the men that was killed
Right.
in the skirmish of the peninsula. And so our family story is that he was killed outside of that cabin, and the people in the cabin got him and pulled him in the cabin and buried him. Of course, there were dirt floors, buried him in there because the Native Americans would have scalped him.
Right.
So that's why he was rescued. Also descended from Almond Ruggles. So I am president and curator for the Firelands Museum. I would invite everybody to come. We have a wonderful museum.
They
and
do.
Our research library is astounding. So I'd invite everybody to come. I do have some pamphlets if anybody wants some that gives hours and things.
Yeah, we had-
It's pardon? Okay. It's two buildings, so it's 4 and 9 K Street in Norwalk. It's right behind Norwalk Public Library. Yeah, we're only open Thursday through Sunday in the summer. So I invite you to get on our website. You can find out information. Thank you.
And the archives, Lakeside's archives is just around the corner on Walnut, and they have a rather large of information on a lot of the cottages. And sometimes when you open up the sheet for your cottage, you find out that you had alligators in your side yard. This was a little while ago. It was 1932.
That's another presentation.
But it was Eliza Pettibone that owned the property, and she had a garden, and she had a couple alligators there. So we have an alligator house. But that is just some of the information that they have at the archives. It's wonderful, the information they have there.
Okay, let's thank Dave and Ed and Barb. If you start digging, you can find out a lot. Just two quick announcements. Any of you are invited to walk with us in the July 4th parade. And Lakeside Heritage Society will again be throwing 900 popcorn balls, so get your grandkids along 2nd Street to pick those up. And also next week, our presentation is by a Lakesider, Carol McKinney, and she's going to talk about Ohio, the mother of U.S. presidents. So Carol McKinney will be here next Sunday, July 7th at 1:30. So thank you all for coming. I'm sure they'll stay up here if you have questions. Thanks again.